Welcome to the lesson 3 of the Arcsight pattern discovery product. In the lesson 1, you have learned about patterns, the concepts behind the pattern discovery, and how Arcsight finds these patterns. Whereas in lesson 2, you learned about creating the profiles and how to use the profile to actually run the profile against the data to find the patterns, and you learned about the snapshot view. In this lesson, lesson 3, you will learn about patterns, actual patterns, and then how to create rules using the patterns, as well as annotating those patterns. We'll also learn about scheduling the pattern discovery runs, as well as the advanced options. So once we have the patterns, let's open up the console. We have in the snapshot view, let's assume I click on this node. Now we can see the patterns here. Let's assume I want to see this pattern here. I can click on this and then click on the inspect pattern. So if I click on that, then the pattern inspector window pops up. Now by default, it gives the name for this pattern with the time and the date of the run. But you can always rename this to something else, which is a much more meaningful name. And it actually gives you the events that it observed in this pattern, as well as the source and target node combinations in which we observe this pattern. For example, if I click on another node and observe this now, there are about 17 transactions, because if you look at this pattern, there are 17 source target combinations between which this particular pattern has occurred, and it gives you that list. It also will tell you the time spread in terms of these transactions. What happened? What is the minimum time difference? What is the maximum time difference between these events? As well as average and deviation times. Once you see the pattern, you can click on the rule creation icon to convert this pattern into an Arcsight rule, which then can observe for those patterns in the real-time events. Remember, pattern discovery is running on historical events, but whereas rules runs on the real-time events. So here is the rules editor, and it actually asks you to give the name for the rule. But if you look at conditions, they are already automatically filled in. Here, again, we are looking for those 3 events occurring in the pattern. So that's why we're looking for those 3 events. But if you observe them, all these 3 events are connected by the logical OR condition, which means we are looking for either one of these 3 events. If you just look at this particular tab of conditions, we're looking for any one of those events, right? But for the rule to really, but in the rules, we are actually looking for the whole pattern, not just one of those events. So how does that work? Because the conditions is looking for just one event, right? So that secret lies in the aggregation tab. So let's go there. Now observe this. Here we are saying we are looking for 3 matches. That means we are looking for 3 events that match these conditions as well as this aggregation. And in the aggregate fields unique tab, we are looking for event.name being unique. That means different. That means all these 3 events must have 3 different name fields. That means the different events must occur for the between the same source and destination addresses, because again aggregate if these fields are identical, that means the same. So in other words, we are trying to make sure we get all these three events occurring between the same source and target destination. That's really how the rule creation works. Now, by doing this type of rule, it's much more efficient because you can also write the same rule by creating this as opposed to a single event rule. You can create a multi-event join rule. That means event 1 looking for this event 2 looking for this event 3 looking for this event, and then have a join event where the sources and target destinations are same between all those three events. That is called type 2 rule that you must have learned in the ACSI class. Now, whereas by writing this in a single event way, it is actually a much more efficient way of doing this than doing a type 2 rule. So that's why we chose to do it this way. Now, another question is, why do I have this AND clause here? See this? Even though there is only one event under this AND clause, why do I have this AND? The reason is, if you go back to the profile, for example, I'm in the rules right now. Let's go to pattern discovery again, and let's open up the profile. If you look at the event fields, that means here, instead of just name, you can have more than one field. Assume there are two fields in this case. Then that combination is what we're looking for, in which case you will put that other field under this AND. Another example of that is in the PowerPoint presentation. So let's look at that here. Here is an example. So in this case, for the pattern, we are looking for a combination of name and device product. So that's why here is the name and device product. Here's the name and device product. Again, the combination is what we're looking for. Okay. The next thing is the time frame. By default, we just simply give 2 minutes. Now, maybe in the future releases, we may look into the time differences in the pattern itself and use that as a way to identify the time frame. But for now, in this release, all you get is 2 minutes. You can always modify that manually, but that's what it is. And by default, the actions are just on first threshold. Again, first threshold, that means all the three events must occur, right? That means the aggregation tab has to be satisfied to get the threshold event. Then we are simply sending that event to the console by making this active. Of course, you can just come here and add other actions that you would like to take. And so here you can give a rule name saying that this is IAS rule and apply. It's saying that you can also, whenever you use the host addresses, it also uses the zone resources. You can say yes to that. Because the combination of address and the zone is what makes it unique within Arcsight. So we're basically saving the rule. next, excuse me. The next thing is, here it is. We saved it, and it is on the IIS role that we saved because I logged in as a user called admin. That's showing up underneath that. Again, if you want to make this active, you need to drag this and put it into real-time folders. Otherwise, the rule itself doesn't do anything until it is in the real-time rules folder, right? So that's what you need to do. In this case, I may just simply link it. Now it will be active in the real-time rules. I'm looking for this pattern in the actual events that are coming in right now. The next thing is we can go to the pattern and you can annotate this pattern. So what does that mean? This is similar to annotating events. Again, by default, each pattern has a stage called queued. That's the default initial stage. Once it is there, you can actually move it into initial stage, follow-up, closed, all these different stages, just like events. So you can change it to initial, and then you can assign that pattern to somebody to look at. For example, let's say I have in the student group, student 12, and you can put some comments. Please look at this. Okay. So again, you can annotate this pattern and assign this pattern to somebody to look at. But once the pattern is investigated and you feel that the pattern is a normal behavior in your network because there's nothing to be concerned about, then you don't even need to convert that into a rule. All you have to do is you can annotate the pattern and say, by the way, I'm going to close this pattern. Okay? So once the pattern is closed, the way you can use that is if you go back to pattern discovery and go into patterns, again the patterns are in this case in the training profile and today's run, and these are the patterns it found. Why is this in training profile? That's because if you go into profile itself, see this, I am actually storing that in the all patterns training group, and that's why I'm coming into all patterns training group, and this is the name of my profile, and these are all the different runs that I had on this profile before. For each run, it actually shows the patterns. Now, I can come here and right click and say view pattern or view patterns with filter. So if I click on that, it asks you, okay, how do you want to see them by? So by doing this and say, you can actually use the user or filter by stage. That means, let's say I want to see by queued. That means I want to see only those patterns that are new, but not the ones that I already closed. Queued is the first one, right? By that means you'll see only the new patterns, not anything else that you are already working on. Say OK. See now, you're seeing only 3 patterns. We used to have 4 patterns before, but one of the stage has changed to closed. That's why we're not seeing that pattern anymore in this view. So the idea is you create the profile, you run the profile against old events and look for patterns, and you take the patterns that you deem them to be normal behavior in your network and convert those patterns and annotate them and close them. Once you close them, later on, let's say you run the same profile against another events, then it actually detects all the patterns. They may be old patterns and new patterns. Pattern discovery always looks for everything. But if it is an old pattern that it already observed before, all it does is it simply goes and updates the pattern itself with new source target combinations between which we observe that pattern again. But the pattern stage itself is not changed. That means if you already closed it, the stage remains to be closed. All we do is just update the transactions here in the snapshot view, if you will. Which means when you come here and use that view patterns with filter and using the stage called queued, you're going to look at only the new patterns, not anything that you already observed and made notes and closed them. This way, you can concentrate on working on the new patterns and also the patterns that may be the zero day attack patterns, as opposed to the normal behavior patterns that you already looked into your system. So that's how the annotation works and helps you in identifying and managing the patterns. All right. The next thing is, well, instead of running this manually, you can also take snapshots by scheduling them. So if you say schedule snapshot on this profile, typical scheduler task editor comes up, and you can click here on the new schedule, type hourly, daily, weekly. So assume that I want to do this daily. And what time do you want to run this? Let's say 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. Okay. And that's it. When you do that, apply, a little calendar comes up on this profile. That means it's being scheduled. So here, it's going to run this profile every day at 2 o'clock. But obviously this one does not make sense because if you look at the start time and end time, we have fixed date and time period. It's going to run against the same data all the time. That doesn't make any sense, right? So which means you will actually create a profile which is somewhat relative profile. That means I can say create new profile and use this now minus 2h. Instead of that, normally what I recommend customers to do is using the today minus 1d and then up to today. What does that mean? Today represents the date without the time component. That means it's midnight. Today minus 1d is midnight yesterday. So you're actually always looking at the 24-hour time period from midnight to midnight of yesterday's data. So by doing this, when you schedule it, then you're always working on this profile on yesterday's data. Whenever you run this, it's always looking at yesterday's data corresponding to that. So that's how you would convert this. And another thing that you should remember is initially when you're working on pattern discovery, you may want to use higher number of pattern length and pattern occurrences so that you can identify those things first, because the higher those numbers are, the less number of patterns it's going to find. Then you can work on that first and then slowly reduce these numbers to work on the normal things. And one last thing is, let's look at the advanced options. Here, again, record the time order and split on inactivity. If you click on the record the time order and run that profile again, what it does is it tells you the pattern, how many times it has happened. In this case, let's say there are these 3 events. And these 3 events, in the order in which those events have occurred. For example, if this event occurred first, second, and third, maybe 10 times, whereas this event occurred and then the second one is this and then the CGI event occurred in that order maybe 20% of the time. So it tells you that time distribution on which these 3 events have occurred. Because if you simply look at the patterns, remember, it gives you the support, but the support itself is the highest number of support shows up first and then the lower number of support, and then, but that does not represent the time sequence. It's just that how many times we have observed. That's all it is. So Obviously, when you click this, it has to do a little more calculations, but that may help you in terms of how the time sequence of these events are occurring, and which means later on when you observe a couple of events, let's say in the real time, you can almost probably estimate that the third event also may occur because that's your usual pattern that you have seen before. So you basically kind of understand this profiling of that pattern. And the split on inactivity is when you have observed the activities and then there's a time lag before which we observe the same pattern between the same source and destination. And if you observe that again, we consider that as a second occurrence. By default, we do not, but if you use this, we will consider that as a second occurrence. So I hope you have a better understanding of what pattern discovery product is all about. And please feel free to contact Arcsight Education Services if you have more specific questions. Goodbye.